My father had been dead for less than 48 hours when my brother told me the ranch belonged to him. He didn't pull me aside. He didn't wait until the neighbors had gone home or until the last casserole had been stacked inside the refrigerator. He said it in Dad's kitchen, standing beside the same oak table where we had eaten Sunday dinners for most of our childhood. The paperwork was handled before he passed, Michael said. His voice was calm, almost bored. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. Outside the kitchen window, 3 men from the volunteer fire department were folding white chairs beneath the cottonwood trees. The funeral reception had ended less than an hour earlier. A few cars still lined the gravel driveway, their tires coated in the pale Kansas dust that never seemed to leave this place. Dad's coffee cup was still beside the sink. Nobody had moved it. "What paperwork?" I asked. Michael looked at his wife before answering. Vanessa stood near the refrigerator in a black dress that looked too expensive for a farmhouse funeral. One hand rested on the strap of her purse. The other held a folder against her chest. That folder was the first thing that made me afraid. "The deed," Michael said. "Dad transferred the property to me." I stared at him. "The ranch." He gave a small nod. "All of it?" "My name is Claire Bennett. I was 41 years old when my father died, and until that afternoon, I believed grief was the heaviest thing a family could carry. I was wrong. Grief is clean compared to betrayal. Grief hurts because someone is gone. Betrayal hurts because someone is still standing in front of you, expecting you to accept what they've done. I had spent the previous 6 months driving from Wichita to Rosefield every weekend to help care for Dad. 2 hours each way, sometimes after 10-hour shifts at the public library where I worked as an archivist. Michael lived 12 minutes from the ranch. He visited when it suited him. Usually when Dad's attorney was there, usually when cattle prices were high, usually when there was something to discuss that involved money. Still, I had never challenged him. That was my mistake. I had spent most of my life believing silence was the same thing as peace. Dad used to say Michael and I came into the world fighting in opposite directions. Michael pushed forward. I stepped aside. He was 6 years older and had always filled whatever room he entered. He talked loudly, made decisions quickly, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never wondered whether he belonged. I was different. I noticed things. The chipped blue paint on the barn door. The way Dad rubbed his thumb across his wedding ring whenever someone mentioned Mom. The sound of the porch swing at night when the wind came from the north. I remembered birthdays, appointments, old promises, and where Dad kept the spare tractor keys. Michael remembered what the land was worth. "Dad would have told me," I said. Vanessa shifted her weight. Michael did not. He didn't want an argument. "So he secretly gave you 800 acres? "It wasn't secret. You just announced it before the funeral flowers were dead." His jaw tightened. "There's no reason to make this ugly, Claire." That sentence stayed with me. People usually say they don't want things to become ugly after they've already done something ugly. I looked toward the hallway. Dad's brown work jacket still hung from the wooden peg beside the back door. The cuffs were stained with grease, and one pocket sagged from years of carrying fence staples. When I was a child, I used to slip my hand inside that pocket and leave him folded notes. "Have a good day, Daddy. Don't forget my school play. I love you more than horses." He kept every one of them in an old metal box in his workshop. At least, I thought he did. "Show me," I said. Vanessa glanced at Michael again. He held out his hand, and she passed him the folder. That tiny exchange told me more than either of them realized. They had rehearsed this. Michael placed the folder on the table but kept his palm resting over it. The transfer was signed 11 days ago. I stopped breathing for a second. 11 days earlier, Dad had been in Mercy County Hospital. He had been weak enough that I had to hold the water glass while he drank. His speech came slowly. Some days he struggled to remember which nurse had just left the room. But he remembered me. On the last evening he was awake, he had squeezed my hand and whispered, "Don't let anybody rush you." I thought he was talking about the funeral. Now I wasn't sure. "He couldn't have signed this 11 days ago," I said. Michael's eyes hardened. "He did. He could barely hold a spoon. He had good moments. I was there every day. And I was there when it mattered." The words landed harder than he intended. Or perhaps exactly as hard as he intended. I looked down at the folder. Michael finally lifted his hand. The first page was a copy of a property transfer. Dad's full legal name appeared near the bottom. Walter James Bennett. Below it was a signature. The shape was familiar. The slant was wrong. I had spent 17 years working with old documents, land records, letters, journals, family Bibles, and courthouse files that had survived fires, floods, and generations of people who believed paper could not remember. Paper remembers everything. The signature in front of me looked like my father's name, but it did not look like my father had written it. I touched the corner of the page. "Where's the original?" Michael pulled the folder back. "With the attorney." "Which attorney?" "Dad's." "Mr. Holloway?" His hesitation lasted less than a second. It was enough. "No," Michael said. "Someone else." Dad had used Samuel Holloway for 32 years. Mr. Holloway had prepared Mom's will, handled the purchase of the North Pasture, and sat beside us in the hospital chapel the night she died. Dad would not have hired someone else without mentioning it. Not for this. Not for the ranch. "You need to leave," Michael said. I looked up slowly. He cleared his throat. "Vanessa and I are going to stay here while we decide what to do with the property." "This is my home too." "No, Claire. It was Dad's home." His hand settled on top of the folder again. "Now, it's mine." Vanessa looked toward the window. She couldn't meet my eyes. That was when I understood something neither of them knew yet. They expected me to cry. They expected me to shout, accuse them, and give Michael the opportunity to call me emotional, difficult, unstable from grief. They expected the younger sister who had spent 41 years stepping aside. So I did the one thing they were not prepared for. I smiled, not because anything was funny, because Dad had taught me never to reveal my hand before I knew what the other person was holding. "All right," I said. Michael blinked. "That's it? For today." I picked up my purse and walked toward the back door. Before leaving, I reached for Dad's brown jacket. Michael stepped forward. "That stays here." I looked at him. "It's a jacket. It belongs to the ranch." "No," I said quietly. "It belonged to our father." For once, Michael had no answer. I carried the jacket outside and crossed the yard toward my car. The late afternoon wind moved through the cottonwoods, scattering a few funeral programs across the grass. I placed Dad's jacket carefully on the passenger seat. Something tapped against the inside of the pocket. At first, I thought it was a loose button. Then I reached in and felt a small brass key. A strip of faded masking tape had been wrapped around the top. Written across it in Dad's unsteady handwriting were 3 words. Claire. Workshop cabinet. I read them twice. Then I looked back at the farmhouse. Michael was standing behind the kitchen window watching me. I closed my fingers around the key and slipped it into my purse before he could see it. At that moment, I still didn't know what my father had hidden inside his workshop. I only knew Michael had lied about the deed, and Dad had left the key to the truth with me. I didn't drive back to Wichita. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot of the small motel on the edge of Rosefield, where traveling auctioneers and cattle buyers usually stayed during the spring sales. The room smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old carpet, but it was quiet, and quiet was exactly what I needed. I locked the door, placed Dad's jacket across the bed, and took the brass key out of my purse. It wasn't special to anyone else, just an old brass cabinet key with a piece of yellowed masking tape wrapped around the top. But my father had never labeled anything unless it mattered, especially during the last few months of his life. Cancer had taken his strength long before it took his voice. When his hands began to shake, he started leaving little notes everywhere. Labels on seed containers, instructions inside toolboxes, dates written on envelopes. He knew his memory wasn't always reliable anymore. So, if he had written my name on this key, he wanted to make sure no one else used it first. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael standing in Dad's kitchen with his hand resting possessively on that folder. "Now it's mine." The words replayed until sunrise. At 6 the next morning, I drove back to the ranch. The gravel driveway looked different without Dad's old pickup parked beside the barn. For as long as I could remember, I measured home by that truck. If it was there, Dad was somewhere nearby, fixing a fence, feeding the horses, checking water lines, waiting on the porch with coffee. Now the space sat empty. It was strange how quickly a place could feel like it belonged to strangers. Michael's truck wasn't there, neither was Vanessa's SUV. Relief settled over me. If they were meeting with attorneys or bankers, I had a little time. The workshop stood 50 yards behind the barn, a weathered wooden building with faded red paint and a tin roof that sang whenever rain rolled across the prairie. Dad used to joke that the workshop knew more family secrets than the house ever would. I believed him. He fixed everything inside those walls: tractors, broken chairs, pocket watches, neighbor disputes, sometimes all in the same afternoon. The padlock opened with a single turn of the key hanging beside the door. Inside, the familiar smell stopped me in my tracks. Motor oil, fresh-cut cedar, coffee, leather. Even after 6 months of hospitals and hospice rooms, the workshop still smelled exactly like my father. I stood there longer than I meant to. Grief has a way of hiding until scent finds it. For one impossible second, I expected to hear his boots crossing the wooden floor. Instead, silence. Sunlight slipped through narrow windows, catching tiny particles of dust floating in the air. Every tool still hung exactly where Dad believed it belonged. He had outlined each wrench and hammer on the pegboard with black marker decades earlier. "If you know where everything belongs," he'd always say, "you notice quicker when something's missing." At the time, I thought he was talking about tools. Now I wondered if he had been talking about people. I looked at the brass key again. Workshop cabinet. There were 4 cabinets, one beside the workbench, one near the compressor, one above the sink, and one tall metal cabinet in the far corner that almost disappeared into the shadows. I walked straight toward the tall one. The brass key slid into the lock perfectly. My heart beat faster. I turned it. Click. The door opened. Inside sat several neatly stacked binders, a small metal cash box, and 3 old cigar boxes I recognized immediately. Dad had kept family keepsakes inside cigar boxes for years. Christmas letters, Mom's recipes, newspaper clippings, little things that mattered only because they belonged to someone he loved. I reached for the top binder. It was labeled in thick black marker, "Property records." Before I could open it, something caught my attention. Dust. Or rather, the lack of it. Every shelf around the binder carried a thin gray layer except for one rectangular space beside the cash box. Something had been sitting there. Recently. Something roughly the size of another binder. I slowly ran my finger across the empty outline. Clean. Whoever removed it had done so after the dust settled. Very recently. Someone had already searched this cabinet. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Michael. He hadn't known about the key, but he had known about the cabinet. Maybe not everything inside it, but enough to remove something. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Panic makes people careless. Curiosity makes them observant. Dad taught me that too. I opened the property records binder. Inside were decades of ranch history, survey maps, tax receipts, fence agreements, water rights, livestock purchases. Everything perfectly organized. Dad's handwriting appeared on nearly every divider. Reading it felt like hearing his voice. Halfway through the binder, an envelope slipped onto the workbench. It wasn't sealed. Across the front, in careful block letters, were 3 words. "If Claire asks." Not, "if something happens." Not after my death. "If Claire asks," as though Dad had expected someone else might reach this cabinet before I did. Inside was a single folded sheet. It wasn't a letter. It was a list. People who can be trusted. Samuel Holloway, Helen Ortiz, Ben Carter. Underneath each name was a phone number. At the bottom, Dad had written one sentence: "Do not sign anything until all 3 have seen it." I stared at those words. Michael hadn't mentioned Samuel Holloway yesterday. He'd claimed another attorney handled the transfer. Why? Unless... Samuel had refused. A noise outside snapped me back to the present. Gravel, crunching beneath tires. Someone had just driven into the yard. I closed the binder immediately. The vehicle door slammed. Then another. Voices. Michael and Vanessa. "They're here," Vanessa whispered outside. "I told you she'd come back," Michael answered. Footsteps approached the workshop. I looked around quickly. There wasn't enough time to search further. I slipped Dad's note into my jacket pocket, locked the cabinet, and returned the brass key to my purse. The workshop door opened before I reached it. Michael filled the doorway. He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "I thought I'd find you here." I was just remembering Dad. His gaze drifted across the room, not toward me, toward the cabinet, only for a fraction of a second. But I noticed, because that's what archivists do. We notice where people look before they remember to hide it. "Find anything interesting?" he asked casually. I met his eyes. "No." He studied my face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Good." The word sounded less like relief, and more like a warning. As I walked past him toward the sunlight, one thought settled into my mind with absolute certainty. Michael wasn't afraid of losing the ranch. He was afraid of something my father had hidden, and whatever had disappeared from that cabinet. It was important enough to make him lie before our father's funeral flowers had even begun to wilt. I waited until I was halfway back to town before pulling onto the shoulder of the road. The prairie stretched in every direction, quiet, except for the wind moving through the dry grass. I turned off the engine and took the folded note from my jacket pocket. 3 names: Samuel Holloway, Helen Ortiz, Ben Carter. Dad hadn't written friends. He had written people who can be trusted. My father chose his words carefully. He always had. If he trusted someone, it wasn't because they agreed with him. It was because they valued the truth more than convenience. I looked at the first name, Samuel Holloway. There was no question where I needed to start. Samuel's office sat on the corner of Main Street, inside a brick building that had been there longer than anyone could remember. The brass plaque beside the door hadn't changed since I was a teenager. Samuel Holloway, attorney at law. When I pushed the door open, the familiar smell of leather-bound books and fresh coffee welcomed me. Linda, his receptionist, looked up from behind her desk. For a second, sadness crossed her face. "Claire?" I smiled gently. "It's good to see you, Linda. I'm so sorry about your father." "Thank you." She hesitated. "You've come about yesterday, haven't you?" That caught my attention immediately. "Yesterday?" She nodded. "Michael stopped by." My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Slow was better. Slow meant I could think. "Is Mr. Holloway available?" She looked toward the hallway. "I'll ask." A minute later, Samuel Holloway appeared in the doorway. He looked older than I remembered. His silver hair was thinner, his shoulders slightly bent, but his eyes were exactly the same, steady, observant, honest. "Claire." Before I could speak, he wrapped both hands around mine. "I wish we were meeting under different circumstances." "So do I." He studied my face for a moment, then quietly said, "You've seen the deed?" It wasn't a question. "You already know." He sighed. "I know your brother showed you paperwork." Was it legitimate? Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his office door. Then he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "I think it's time your father stopped carrying this burden alone." I sat. He remained standing for another moment, looking out the window toward Main Street. "About 3 weeks before Walter died," he began, "he came here. He was that sick?" Samuel nodded. "He insisted on driving himself." That sounded exactly like Dad. Too proud to ask for help. "He wanted to update his estate." I leaned forward. "What changed?" "He wanted to make sure neither child felt abandoned. Neither child. Not just Michael. Not just me. He believed the ranch should stay in the family," Samuel continued, "but he also believed ownership should come with responsibility." "That sounds like him." Samuel smiled sadly. "It does." He opened one of the desk drawers and removed a yellow legal pad. Across the top were handwritten notes. "Walter Bennett Estate." I drafted a revised will. My heart skipped. A revised will? Yes. "So where is it?" Samuel looked directly into my eyes. It was never signed. The room became strangely quiet. "What happened?" "The morning Walter was supposed to return." Samuel stopped. He called. "What did he say?" He sounded frightened. That single word didn't belong beside my father. Frightened. Samuel continued softly. "He told me not to prepare any more documents." "Did he explain why?" "No. He simply said..." Samuel opened a small notebook. I wrote it down because it struck me as unusual. He adjusted his glasses and read the sentence exactly as Dad had spoken it. "Someone in this family wants my signature more than they want my time?" Every hair on my arm stood up. That didn't sound like a dying man confused by medication. That sounded like a man who had realized something was terribly wrong. I swallowed carefully. "Did you ever see him again?" Samuel shook his head. No. What about the deed Michael showed me? His expression hardened for the first time. I never prepared it. My heartbeat became almost painfully loud. Then who did? I don't know. But I can tell you this. He folded his hands together. Your father refused every suggestion I made to transfer ownership before his death. He said the ranch wasn't something that should be won. Samuel looked toward the framed photograph of Dad hanging on the bookshelf. He said it should be earned. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me since yesterday. Do you believe my father signed that deed? Samuel answered without hesitation. No. Not. I'm unsure. Not. It depends. Simply, no. The certainty in his voice settled something inside me. For the first time since the funeral, I realized I wasn't imagining the inconsistencies. Someone else saw them too. Someone my father had trusted for over 30 years. Samuel reached into another drawer. This belongs to you. He handed me a sealed envelope. Across the front, in Dad's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words. Only if you doubt. I stared at it. When did he leave this? The same day we discussed his will. Why didn't you give it to me before? Because he instructed me not to. And now? Samuel's expression grew solemn. You came here carrying doubt. I carefully turned the envelope over. The seal had never been broken. Dad had prepared for this. Not every detail, but enough to leave a trail. As I slipped the envelope into my purse, Samuel spoke again. Claire. Yes? If Michael becomes impatient? I looked up. He'll make mistakes. Why? Because impatient people believe speed is strength. He smiled faintly. Your father always said your strength was different. What did he say? Samuel chuckled quietly. He said, Michael sees opportunities. He paused. But Claire notices what everyone else walks past. I felt tears threaten for the first time since Dad died. Not because of the ranch, because even at the end, he had seen me. As I stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I answered. Hello? A man's voice spoke quickly. Miss Bennett? Yes. My name is Ben Carter. The 3rd name on Dad's list. I think we need to meet. My grip tightened around the phone. Why? There was a long silence. Then he quietly said, Because someone broke into your father's workshop last night. The world seemed to stop. I was driving past after checking my cattle. His breathing grew uneven. I saw a flashlight inside. I closed my eyes. The cabinet, the missing binder, someone had gone back. And somehow, they already knew they hadn't found everything. Ben Carter asked me to meet him at Miller's Diner instead of the ranch. I don't think it's a good idea for either of us to go back there right now, he said before hanging up. His voice carried the steady confidence of a man who had spent his life making practical decisions. Dad had trusted very few people without reservation, and Ben Carter was apparently one of them. 20 minutes later, I slid into a booth near the back of the diner. The lunch crowd had already disappeared, leaving only the sound of coffee being poured and an old country song drifting from the radio behind the counter. Ben stood as soon as he saw me. He looked to be in his early 60s, broad-shouldered despite his age, with sun-weathered skin and the kind of rough hands that belonged to someone who still fixed his own fences. He removed his cap. I'm sorry about Walter. Thank you. He didn't waste time with small talk. You went to the workshop yesterday? It wasn't a question. Yes. I figured you would. You saw someone there last night? He nodded once. A pickup pulled into the yard around 10. Michael's? I couldn't tell. It was dark. What happened? I stopped along the county road because one of my trailer lights wasn't working. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug before continuing. I noticed a flashlight moving inside Walter's workshop. My stomach tightened. I thought maybe it was you. So, you went over? I started walking. What happened then? The light went out. Did they leave? They heard my truck door. He looked directly into my eyes. Whoever it was knew exactly how to get out the back. The back? Ben nodded. Most folks don't even know the workshop has a second door. I did. Dad had built it decades earlier so tractors could be driven straight through without turning around, but very few people remembered it. Unless they had spent years inside that building, like Michael. Ben reached into his jacket pocket. I found this. He placed a small metal object on the table between us. It was old, covered in dirt. I picked it up carefully. A cabinet hinge screw, bent almost beyond recognition. I frowned. What is this? It was lying beneath the cabinet in the corner. My pulse quickened. The tall cabinet? That's the one. I turned the screw over in my fingers. Fresh scrape marks covered the threads. Someone hadn't simply opened the cabinet. They had tried to remove it from the wall. They were looking behind it, I whispered. Ben slowly nodded. I think so. A strange mixture of relief and fear settled over me. Relief. Because whoever searched the workshop hadn't known exactly where to look. Fear. Because they believed something was still hidden there. Ben leaned closer. Claire. Yes? Did Walter ever tell you about the false wall? For a second, I simply stared at him. The what? His eyebrows lifted. He never showed you? I shook my head. No. Ben looked genuinely surprised. He built it after your mother passed away? My heartbeat became painfully slow. What are you talking about? The cabinet doesn't sit against the outside wall. It never did. There's empty space behind it. I remembered the cabinet. Heavy, bolted in place, impossible to move without tools, unless someone knew exactly how. When was the last time you saw it opened? I asked. Ben thought for a moment. Probably last winter. Dad was organizing paperwork. He laughed and told me. Ben smiled sadly. Some things only matter when the right person is ready to find them. Those sounded exactly like my father. He had always believed timing mattered as much as truth. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. Michael, I stared at the screen. Ben noticed immediately. You going to answer? I considered it, then pressed accept. Claire. Michael sounded strangely pleasant. I've been trying to reach you. I've been busy. We need to talk. About what? The ranch. I waited. After a few seconds, he continued. I've decided to make this easier for both of us. That sentence immediately put me on guard. I'm willing to buy your share. My share. You know what I mean. No, I don't. He sighed impatiently. You've always been practical. I'll write you a generous check. You can move on. I almost laughed. Move on, as though the last 40 years of memories could be reduced to a bank transfer. What makes you think I want to sell something you insist I don't own? Silence. Just long enough. Then, because fighting this won't end well for you. The warmth disappeared from his voice. Only the warning remained. I'll think about it, I replied calmly. Good. And Michael? Yeah? If everything is legal... I paused, deliberately. Why are you in such a hurry? He didn't answer. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. Ben hadn't missed a word. That wasn't an offer, he said quietly. It was pressure. I nodded. He wants this finished before I learn something. Ben looked toward the diner window. The afternoon sun reflected off parked pickup trucks outside. Then he turned back to me. I think it's time you saw what's behind that cabinet. We can't. Why not? Michael may already be watching the ranch. Ben smiled. So we don't go today. What are you thinking? He reached into his wallet and removed a folded photograph. It showed my father and Ben standing inside the workshop years earlier. They were smiling over some half-finished project. Behind them, almost hidden in the shadows, was the tall metal cabinet, except it wasn't against the wall. There was a narrow gap behind it. Barely visible unless someone knew where to look, Dad hadn't hidden the space. He had hidden the fact that it existed. Ben slid the photograph back into his wallet. We go tomorrow before sunrise. When no one's expecting us. I looked out the diner window toward the endless Kansas fields. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't chasing answers anymore. I knew exactly where they were, hidden behind a cabinet that someone had already tried and failed to remove. Whatever my father had left there. It was valuable enough to make Michael panic. And desperate people almost always made the mistakes that finally revealed the truth. The alarm on my phone went off at 4:15 a.m. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I saw Dad's jacket hanging over the chair in the motel room, and everything came rushing back. The funeral, Michael, the deed, the note, the hidden space behind the cabinet. By 4:45, I was pulling into the gravel lot behind Miller's Diner, where Ben Carter was already waiting in his faded blue pickup. He climbed out carrying a heavy toolbox. "You sleep?" "Not much." He smiled. "Good." I raised an eyebrow. People think clearer when they know something important is waiting. It sounded exactly like something Dad would have said. Without another word, we drove toward the ranch. The roads were empty. Only the occasional farmhouse light glowed in the darkness. As we turned onto the long gravel driveway, my chest tightened. The house sat completely dark. Michael's truck wasn't there. Neither was Vanessa's SUV. "Looks clear," Ben said. "Let's hope it stays that way." The workshop greeted us with the same familiar scent of cedar and machine oil. Only this time, I wasn't here to remember my father. I was here to finish what he'd started. Ben walked directly to the tall metal cabinet. He knelt beside it and pointed his flashlight toward the base. "See these?" Fresh scrape marks stretched across the concrete floor. They tried pulling it forward, but they couldn't. It weighs nearly 400 pounds. He looked up at me. "Unless they knew the release." He grinned. "Exactly. The release." Instead of answering, Ben reached beneath the wooden workbench beside the cabinet. His fingers disappeared underneath for several seconds. Then, click. A dull metallic sound echoed through the workshop. I stared. The cabinet. It isn't bolted. It only looks that way. Together, we pushed. The enormous cabinet rolled sideways with surprising ease. Behind it, there wasn't a wall. There was a narrow passage just wide enough for one person. Cold air drifted from the darkness. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. "Dad built this?" Ben nodded. "Nearly 15 years ago?" "Why?" He said every ranch needed one place where paperwork mattered more than money. I stepped into the opening. The hidden room measured only 6 feet across. Rough wooden shelves lined one wall. A small work table stood beneath a single battery-powered lantern. Everything was covered with a thin layer of dust, except one spot. The center of the table. Someone had recently searched here. "They found this place," I whispered. Ben slowly nodded. "They just didn't find everything." My flashlight swept across the shelves. Old account books, tin boxes, photo albums, several leather binders, and a weathered wooden chest tucked beneath the table. Unlike everything else, it had a brass lock. My brass key. Hands shaking slightly, I inserted it. The lock turned immediately. Inside lay dozens of carefully organized envelopes, everyone labeled. Bank records, medical documents, insurance, livestock contracts. Then I saw one that stole my breath. "Read last, Dad." Even now, he was still giving instructions. I carefully set it aside. Beneath it rested a thick black ledger. Its cover read, "Ranch Meetings." Private Ben leaned closer. "I've never seen that." I opened the first page. The entries stretched back almost 3 years. Dad had recorded conversations after important meetings. Dates, visitors, topics discussed. Nothing dramatic until the final months. My eyes landed on an entry from 4 weeks before he died. Michael insisted I transfer ownership immediately. Another. He says probate will ruin everything. I told him no. Another. Vanessa brought documents I refused to sign. I looked at Ben. Neither of us spoke. I kept reading. Then I reached the final completed entry. It was only 3 sentences. I read them twice before saying them aloud. Michael doesn't understand. The ranch isn't the inheritance. The truth is. Silence filled the hidden room. "What does that mean?" I whispered. Ben rubbed his chin. "I don't know. But Walter never wrote anything without purpose." I carefully turned the page. Blank. The next page. Blank. Then something slipped from inside the back cover. A folded receipt. No. A storage rental agreement. I unfolded it carefully. Prairie View Storage Unit 27. Rental paid 12 months in advance. Start date. 6 weeks before Dad died. I frowned. Dad rented a storage unit? Ben looked just as confused. He never mentioned it. Neither had Michael, which meant one of two things. Either Michael didn't know it existed, or he had been searching for proof that it did. Suddenly, crunch. Gravel outside. Ben instantly switched off his flashlight. Another vehicle. The sound grew louder, then stopped. My heart pounded. Headlights swept briefly across the workshop windows before disappearing. Someone had pulled into the yard. Quiet voices drifted through the morning air. A truck door slammed. Ben barely breathed. "Don't move." Footsteps approached the workshop. Slow, deliberate. Not one person. Two. A beam of light slipped beneath the workshop door. Someone was outside. Then came Michael's voice. "I know she's in here." Every muscle in my body tightened. Vanessa spoke more quietly. "If she found it..." Michael cut her off. "Then we take it before she leaves." Ben looked at me in the darkness. For the first time since Dad's funeral, fear wasn't the strongest emotion inside me anymore. It was certainty. Michael wasn't protecting an inheritance. He was hunting evidence, and judging by the panic in his voice, he still hadn't found what my father had gone to such extraordinary lengths to hide. The workshop fell silent. No one inside moved. No one outside spoke for several seconds. Then I heard Michael again. "Check the back." My stomach dropped. He knew about the second door. Ben leaned close enough that I could barely hear him whisper, "Stay here." Before I could protest, he slipped out of the hidden room and quietly rolled the cabinet back into place from the inside. The movement was almost silent. From where I stood, I could hear only the faint scrape of metal on concrete. A second later, the workshop door creaked open. "She's not here," Ben called out casually. His voice was so natural that, for an instant, even I believed him. "What are you doing here?" Michael demanded. "I could ask you the same thing. We own this property." Ben didn't answer immediately. Instead, I heard the familiar sound of a toolbox being set on the workbench. "Walter asked me to fix the hydraulic press weeks ago. Seems like a good morning to finish the job." "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't much care what you believe." For nearly a minute, neither man spoke. The silence was almost louder than an argument. Then Vanessa's heels clicked across the concrete floor. "I told you nobody would be here." Michael lowered his voice, but not enough. "Look around anyway." Footsteps spread through the workshop. A drawer opened. A cabinet door slammed. Metal tools rattled. They weren't searching randomly. They were looking for something specific. Hidden in the narrow room behind the cabinet, I barely dared to breathe. My flashlight remained off. Only a thin line of dawn filtered through tiny cracks in the wood. I looked down at the wooden chest. The envelope Dad had labeled "Read Last" rested on top. If Michael found this room, there would be no second chance. Very carefully, I slipped the envelope inside my jacket. Then I reached for the black ledger. Too large, too obvious. Instead, I opened it one final time, hoping for something I had missed. Near the back cover, several pages had been glued together. Not by accident. Deliberately. I slid my fingernail between them. The paper separated with a soft tear. Inside was a folded photograph. It showed Dad standing beside the ranch entrance nearly 20 years earlier. Michael stood on one side. I stood on the other. Nothing unusual. Until I turned the photograph over. Dad had written one sentence. "The answer isn't on the ranch." My pulse quickened. Not on the ranch. Then where? The storage unit? Unit 27. Everything suddenly made sense. Dad hadn't hidden the most important evidence here. He'd hidden directions. The workshop had never been the destination. It was only the map. Outside, Michael's patience was beginning to crack. "I know there was another file," Ben answered calmly. "I've got no idea what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. I'm too old to start now." Something crashed against the workbench. Wood splintered. Vanessa gasped. "Michael, I said there was another binder. You told me it would still be here." Those words echoed inside my head. You told me. Not I thought. Not I assumed. Someone had told Michael another binder existed. Someone besides Dad. Someone who had seen this room before. The realization chilled me. Whoever had helped create the fake deed wasn't working alone. They had inside information. And they were still out there. Another loud bang interrupted my thoughts. Ben's voice hardened. That's enough. I'll tear this whole building apart if I have to. You'll be destroying property that still belongs to Walter's estate. Michael laughed bitterly. Not for long. The words were followed by the unmistakable sound of a phone vibrating. A few seconds later, Vanessa spoke. It's him, Michael answered immediately. What? His voice changed. The anger disappeared. Now he sounded nervous. What do you mean she saw him? Silence. Then, no. Don't let her leave. My heartbeat skipped. Who had seen whom? Michael paced across the workshop floor. When? Another pause. Then his voice dropped to a whisper I could barely hear. Damn it. He ended the call. Vanessa looked at him. What happened? Michael spoke through clenched teeth. Helen Ortiz just met with Claire. Ben and I exchanged a glance through the narrow crack in the cabinet. Helen Ortiz, the second name on Dad's list. Michael hadn't known where I actually was. He was guessing. And somehow, someone had just lied to him. Good. Let him chase the wrong trail. After another tense minute, Michael finally exhaled. We're wasting time. We need to get to Prairie View before she does. My breath caught. The storage unit. He knew about it. But if he was rushing there now, he didn't have what he needed. He was still searching. Truck doors slammed outside, the engine started, gravel sprayed beneath spinning tires. Then, silence. Ben waited another full minute before sliding the cabinet aside. You okay? I nodded slowly. I heard everything. So did I. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I held up the photograph. Dad left us another clue. Ben read the words on the back. His eyes widened. The answer isn't on the ranch. He wanted someone to find the storage unit. I showed him the rental agreement. Unit 27. Ben rubbed the back of his neck. If Michael's headed there, we don't have much time. I looked down at the envelope inside my jacket. Read last. For the first time, I considered opening it. But I couldn't. Dad had trusted me enough to leave instructions. If he wanted me to read it last, there had to be a reason. I think we leave it sealed, I said. Ben smiled. Your father would have liked that. As we stepped out into the cool morning air, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the empty fields. The ranch looked peaceful, beautiful, as if nothing had changed. But beneath that quiet landscape, a race had begun. Michael was speeding towards Storage Unit 27, convinced it held the evidence that could destroy him. What he didn't know was that Dad had stayed one step ahead of him until the very end. And for the first time since the funeral, I wasn't following my brother anymore. He was following the trail my father had carefully laid, exactly where Dad wanted him to go.